Hello, I'm Bob the Booker and welcome to my channel. And today I wanted to talk about Not a River by Selva, Almada and translated by Annie McDermott. Yes, we're in an International Booker Prize season. I finally read my first book from the long list. This has been an interesting long list as well for the sake that, for the fact that in previous years I've read one or two by the time the list comes out. With this I'd read none. So I'm kind of excited to sort of break that and kind of actually read the first one, a very short one, but to read the first book in there. So I'm going to talk a bit about this book. There will be some spoilers later in the video, but I'll keep the vast majority of this as spoiler free as possible, and I'll mention when spoilers are about to come. But in that case, otherwise apart from that, let's get started. So this book, published by Charco Press, who are a wonderful, wonderful press, mostly publishing South American literature. They're no stranger to a good prize list, and particularly the International Booker. But this book is part of a sort of a loose trilogy. The books aren't interconnected in terms of characters or what have you, but mostly in terms of themes, and particularly the theme of men and masculinity in rural Argentina, essentially, is what that mostly looks like. I've read Brickmakers by her as well, which I really enjoyed, but it is brutal. And Not a River follows some quite similar themes. So the core idea of this is there are three men who have a place that they like to go fishing in. They're part of a relatively small community, and it's a small community that's mostly, most of their lives focus around sort of general subsistence of, making food, kind of bringing things to market, all of that kind of jazz. And the kind of, particularly the novel focuses in on some of their interpersonal relationships as well, and particularly the relationships between men and women within the book and within that village or that area. And right from the beginning we kind of get a sense of this sort of quiet man's world, where these three men go out on these sort of fishing journeys. There's a spot they really like. It's a spot that seems in some ways laced with danger, but is also just the place that they go, and that's what they do. And it's almost this sort of legacy of year on year, generation after generation, people come to the same spots, they do the same things in the parts of land, and life kind of continues. And this book in many ways plays around with that idea of what does it look like going forward. It doesn't focus too much on the legacy per se of what immediately comes next, but there is a real sense, I felt, throughout the novel of, well, it's always been like this and we pass it on to the next generation, and this is just the way that things are. This is the way that men behave, this is the way that women behave. We've got our roles, we've got the things that we do, and you shouldn't really transgress that. And a big part of that as well is sort of where myth and legend come into things. So there are sort of superstitions around various parts of the world that they live in. You don't do this, you do this. And there's an example that comes up in the book quite early on about, trying the kind of superstitions around, if you do this, a bad thing will happen or a good thing will happen, and you've got to kind of keep people on side, and you've got to make sure that the right things are done, and even where you sit or how you interact with people. And that's a really big part of it. And I think what this book then does that's quite interesting is plays around with that core idea of what happens when you break out of some of those rules, what happens when you start to do things that are not the normal perceived thing. And what does that also sort of look like in terms of gender? The men in this book largely spend their lives doing various things. And without going into spoilers, there is a sort of tragic event that is referenced in the book. And that tragic event, there's a sort of feeling around that this is more than just an accident of something bad, but maybe there was some kind of malicious spirit involved, or there's whatever else. And so the book really plays around with this idea, particularly the interactions between men and women, where a few of the men see women who they like and are kind of drawn to in some way, and it's almost treated like a kind of market of, well, I want this person, but do they also come with these other things that are useful for our livelihood and whatever else. But the book then plays with that in these sorts of the sort of brutal ways that things are spoken about. There's a character who we're introduced to, and everyone has this strong sense of, oh, well, nobody else can sleep with her apart from me and maybe this other guy. And then actually it's found that more people have been doing that. And it's interesting what that suddenly does to sort of blow up the stability of people around them, that actually, if this is a core idea of who you are, everybody has their fixed role, everybody goes and does the same things. You find a person, you date them, you're with them, then there are all these different various ways that things can get blown up. I think as a novel itself, I found it really interesting for the kind of spareness, if that's a word, of the language. It's very stripped back. This is barely 100 pages as a novel. And quite a lot of what it does in that space is, I think, quite profound and quite interesting. Including the way that it actually does dialogue. It takes a little bit of getting used to, and I can totally see why people would be put off by it. But dialogue, for example, let's find a good example now. Here we go. So roll one for me, says Xiomara, and as a separate line, separate sentence. They blah blah blah. They chucked it. Can you believe? He says. And you've got all these sort of little things. And at first I realised that doesn't sound, that's just a small stylistic chance. But there's kind of a way that is written that, in my mind, the rhythm of this book built up into feeling like, almost like the narrator was having an extra dig or an extra way of kind of inserting themselves into the text. So this thing happened, he says. This thing happened, she said. And sometimes the playing around with tenses or the intentional breaking up of that adds this kind of slightly sinister feel to this book, where it's almost like, well, this character says it, but do they really believe it? Or this thing is sort of said, and is it kind of foretold? Is it a prophecy almost, the way the character's talking? I may be massively overreading reading too much into that whole thing. But there's something about that stylistic choice for me that feels very intentional and very, and often I feel like adds to this sort of weird malaise to the text. There's a slightly uneasy feel through a lot of this book that I found really interesting. And with that in mind, I'm going to go into a few bits of spoilers, but I think this is a really interesting book. Before I get there, a really interesting book, and I see why it made the long list. Brickmakers, I think, was, for me personally, more successful in sort of talking about some of the kind of the aspects of masculinity and of macho culture or whatever. But there's something really interesting hiding under the surface here about the way this book slowly meanders unintentionally, given the title of this book, meanders between various ideas and topics, and there's a kind of mood and tone to this book that I found really quite fascinating. So with that, I'm going to go into some spoilers. So, about to go into some light spoilers. Feel free to drop out now if you need to. But yeah, I think what's really interesting in this book is the way that it really focuses around a couple of key moments and relationships. So particularly the relationship between our main character, or sort of main character, Inero, and the sisters who he is sort of involved with in some way. Lucy and Mariella, I think they are. And what's sort of interesting is there's almost a sense where he's given them as a choice, and one of them likes him more, and it's this whole thing. One of them's plainer and less interesting or whatever, and the other one is kind of this odd thing of, it's not a sort of predestined wedding, but there is an element to which those become the only two candidates in this world that they live in. And while all of this is happening, and this sort of the kind of superstition around this, there's also reference to a bus crash or a kind of truck crash, which is meant to be taking people to a party. And there's something almost about the way that this book deals with it in a kind of coldness that I thought was really interesting. We've kind of got two narratives juxtaposed against each other at one point, where we've got some characters who are going to a bar and having a decent time, and then we also have these people who are who die in this crash, and there's a kind of idea of them going into the water, which parallels so much about this fishing lake and this kind of the fishermen at the heart of this book. So there's sort of something about the kind of murky secrets in this book that, you know, the characters think they understand the water in this fishing spot. It's got all these kind of superstitions and lore around it. And actually, it's also a place where people can die, but also where fish can be caught and where all these other things happen. And so there's this kind of rootedness to the land that makes this book, I think, really interesting, because the land that they are surrounded by is the place that gives them nourishment, is the place that feeds them to some degree, and what have you. It's where they all sort of belong, quote unquote. You know, it's their home. It's their kind of, the lore of many, many generations has been passed down to them. But that's also to some degree trapped them in this location, that they are unable to kind of escape not only physically the geography of it, even when they die, they end up in the water of this place, or, you know, buried in the ground around this place. And there's an idea that these generations speak to the next generation and keep this kind of going. But the book also does quite a lot in terms of, yeah, how they are trapped kind of by the kind of strictures of the world around them. It's believed still, yeah, men will have to be a certain way, women will have to be a certain way in this land. And we see that unless anything major happens, people born and die, are born and then die in exactly the same place. And this land is ever changing, and it's almost like they don't need to exist. The world will be there far longer than they will be. They're sort of but a speck of dust. And I think this book kind of captures something about that really interestingly. It's also something that I thought was really interesting about brickmakers. But Almada, I think, does something really special here in terms of the stripped back nature of it. We don't often hear, for example, many of the men in this book talk. They're quite stoic and quite quiet in many ways. A lot of us reading or learning about the men in the book is sort of done by us watching them, or watching their actions, or occasionally having little insights into their heads. For the women in the book, they do a fair amount of the talking, and they are kind of much more able to express what's going on in the world around them. In many ways, they are the people who tell the stories and explore the kind of tragedies or successes or bits of enjoyment around them. And there's something here about the kind of quiet working class masculinity that I thought was really interesting. And the book itself, by being so spare and stripped back, kind of allows that. This is quite a, I've used quiet books quite a lot to talk about things, and I don't mean that in an insulting way of, you know, that they are missing something. But there is something about the intentionally stripped back nature of this book that I found quite captivating. That the book kind of allows these little spaces in between for things to breathe, and then suddenly we move on, and suddenly we're not talking about the truck anymore, and suddenly we're not talking about the fishing pond or anything else anymore. We're on to something else, but it's connected. This whole world is connected. They don't have any choice but for everything to be connected. Everyone knows what everyone is doing. Everyone sees everything. And there's a joy to that in some ways in the book, but this book also pokes at where some of those things are incredibly complex. And I think that's something that I found really quite captivating about it. Anyway, I've been rambling about this book. I hope you enjoyed the book if you've had a chance. If you do want to leave comments, great. Just where possible, try to avoid any spoilers in the comments, or bury them far down so it could kind of get hidden as well. But yeah, I hope you are enjoying this book. I'm excited to read the other 12 International Booker Prize long listed books. Have a great time, and speak to you all soon. Bye bye.